Good afternoon, guys. First of all, thank you very much for coming back. Appreciate that. My name is Damien Cottle. I've met some of you already, I think, today. For those of you I didn't manage to meet during the day, I'm the Managing Director of Pegasus Resource Management. We provide human factor training for the NHS. We also specialise in culture change. We look at checklist creation and design as well, amongst other things. Away from Pegasus, I'm also a commercial training pilot. Work for British Airways. I've been flying for them for 21 years now, which makes me feel very old. And in that role, I spend the majority of the time in a very different black box, the simulators at Heathrow, where I spend my time training and checking pilots. I'm going to begin today by asking you a question. It's just going to be one question, don't worry, and that'll be it. Just a raise of hands, if you would, please, guys. So my question is, in your professional capacity, who here hasn't made a mistake this week? Raise your hand if you haven't made a mistake professionally this week. Mark, you can keep your hand down. So a couple. How about in the last month? Anyone here not made a mistake in the last month? No. So mistakes happen. We make mistakes, we make errors. That's okay. It's okay to make mistakes. What isn't okay is to have a culture where people are fearful of speaking up when they make mistakes. What isn't okay is having a culture where you don't know what's happening and so you can't possibly learn. And today we're going to look at a culture which will help you learn from your mistakes and hopefully improve your operation. Black box culture. So we're going to look at exactly what that is, why it's important, and then we're going to look at how we create it. So what is black box? Well, it started in the 60s and 70s. Airlines were making a lot of mistakes, there were a lot of crashes, and as with today, whenever there was a crash, one of the first things they would do is look for this. It's neither black nor particularly boxy, but that is the black box. And the idea is that you investigate the black box to find out exactly what's happened so you can learn from the mistakes and you can try and prevent that happening again. Now, black box culture takes the idea of a black box, but then says, hang on, everybody in your organization could be a living, breathing black box. Everybody there could feed information back, which will either tell you why something bad's happened, or even better, could preempt it and tell you, hang on, there are things going wrong already. If we don't do something about this, this could end up in some kind of never event. And because it involves people, and it's not to do with technology, it can be used anywhere. We use it with healthcare providers, such as yourselves. Elite sports teams use this. We've got safety critical industries, banks, world of finance, food producers. It pretty much works in any industry. How does it really work? Well, if you and your team going about your day-to-day job, you're going to make decisions. Then you go about your job, and one of the things you're going to try and do is minimize the risk of making an error. Now, if you don't get the culture right, this learning circle here will stop. If people are scared of making errors, if people are scared of admitting to their errors, you're not going to get that flow of information back into the culture. And in turn, that's not going to come back to help them make better decisions. What's actually going to happen is you're going to keep making the same bad decisions, making the same errors over and over again. Now, if you get the culture right, that flow of information with that black box culture will move up. You'll know exactly what's happening, why it's happening. You can then feed that back down to help your teams, to help your individuals make better decisions and make fewer errors. A little bit of human factors sprinkled in there, communication, seniority gradient, that'll help it along the way. The net result is your productivity is going to go up, and your errors and your never events are going to go down. Okay, so that's what black box culture is. Any questions so far? Great. So now we're going to look at why it's important. So this first example, this is a BEA flight from 1972. It was a flight from Heathrow to Brussels. And if we look at the next slide, what you can see here, this is a map of the The Heathrow area, if you look along the top, that long black line, that is the flight path of the aircraft. So it's taking off on that runway, and then it's turning down to the south. The red letters there, numbers I should say, that's the time in seconds from the beginning of the takeoff. So, on this particular day, the aircraft took off, fully serviceable, trained crew, and as it did so, it started to accelerate and turn to the south. Now, I'm sure most of you have sat over a wing at some point and seen the front and the back of the wing curves out. So that's the high lift devices. That means you get more lift from the wing, it means you can fly slower, so you use less runway to take off and land. And then as you accelerate, what you do is retract those things. We have flaps at the back of the wing and slats at the front. You retract them so you can go faster. So it's really important on an aircraft that you get the order correct. You need the slats at the back to come up, flaps at the back I should say, to come up first, and then the slats, which are the ones at the front of the wing, they come up last. If you don't get the order right, the aircraft stalls, and you end up with this situation. This day, the co-pilot went to select the lever for the flaps, the ones at the back, got the lever selection wrong and selected the slats instead. The wing stalled, the aircraft plummeted 5,000 feet, and they crashed in the field near Staines. 118 people on board lost their lives, and it's still the worst loss of life in British aviation history. So this one's got a bit of a personal aspect for me. My grandfather was a BEA captain at the time. He happened to be driving home when it happened. He stopped the car, ran across. He was one of the first people on the scene. When he got there, he instinctively went to the flight deck to try and help his colleagues. They were beyond help. Everyone had perished already. And I remember him telling me, though, that when he looked into the flight deck, one of the first things he saw was the fact that the slat lever had been moved up and the flaps were still out. And he told me there and then he was pretty certain that's what caused the crash. And what he also told me was that he had made that same mistake himself before. Moved the slats only to realize quickly what he'd done and bring it back. And he also told me that he'd seen it dozens of other people do exactly the same thing, but fortunately reverse the selection. So, black box culture, what's that got to do with it? Well, the investigators, they investigated the black box, they discovered what the pilots had done, and the manufacturers of the aircraft then retrofitted it so you could no longer make that same selection. You couldn't physically move that slat lever until the flaps had been moved. Now, if you'd had the culture right back then, if back then people had been felt safe to admit to their errors and explain exactly what they'd done, the manufacturer would have found out years before that this was an issue that was going to lead to a big problem, and they could have retrofitted those aircraft before 118 people lost their lives. Moving on, something closer to home, sepsis. So you've got a lady on the left-hand side, her name's Margaret, and the gent on the right, his name's Tom. Both Margaret and Tom both got admitted to hospital feeling unwell, both displaying symptoms of sepsis. Both of them were screened incorrectly and didn't receive treatment until it was too late. In Margaret's case, she lost her life. In Tom's case, he unfortunately lost all 4 limbs and the lower half of his face. Now, it's not an unusual occurrence, sepsis. It affects 250,000 people a year. That's just in the UK. It kills more than breast, bowel, and prostate cancer, and it's one of the leading causes of preventable deaths in the UK. 14,000 people a year. It's more common than heart attacks. So let's look at Margaret's case first. So Margaret's family had to push for answers. It took 2 years of pushing for answers before the trust finally published a report explaining exactly what had happened. Explaining that she hadn't been screened for sepsis, and when finally she wasn't given the treatment soon enough. So thinking about learning from your mistakes, you'd hope at that point the trust would take that fairly seriously, given that it affects 250,000 people a year, and would have learned a lesson. What actually happened, you'll find 2 years later, in the same trust, only 1% of patients who should have been screened for sepsis actually were. 1%. And of that 1%, only half of them were actually given the treatment they needed within the first hour. That's lessons not being learned. Why not? Well, if you speak to Tom or his wife and ask them why they think it is, this is what they said. I don't think the NHS is geared up for investigation and learning from the results. It's not about beating people up for making mistakes. Mistakes are easy to make. It's about fessing up and learning from what went wrong so it doesn't go wrong again. Mistakes are going to make, and that is forgivable, but not learning from your mistakes, not having the culture right, isn't it? More recently, the Ockenden report. Anyone not familiar with that? Okay. When you look at what happened there, Trust presided over catastrophic failings for over 2 decades. 2 decades of making the same repeated mistakes. Failed to investigate, failed to learn, failed to improve. And when you look at why, the report highlights a number of matters, not least of which lack of staff, which I accept is across the NHS. But not far down the list after that, it said this: staff were frightened to speak out about failings amid a culture of undermining and bullying. And more widely, the NHS must demonstrate the ability to admit to mistakes, learn from them, and promote a culture of openness. That culture. And this isn't just one trust, and I'm not trying to beat anyone up here. That's one trust, but if you look more widely, CQC reports from 2021 into other maternity wards cited these for failings, a reflection of the culture issues in maternity services nationally. This includes a defensive culture, dysfunctional teams, and safety lessons not learned. Long-standing poor staff culture with creating ineffective teams. And at the bottom there, when things go wrong in maternity wards, staff often fail to admit their errors due to a culture of blame instead of learning. Said before, you get the culture wrong, you don't learn your lessons. None of that flow of information happens, and all you do is keep making the same mistake over and over again. Now these guys here, this is the team from Birmingham Children's Hospital. A while ago, they had a rating of, I believe, inadequate. The chief exec and the team took the feedback on board. They turned this hospital around. A few years after the first report, they were inspected again, and they became the first children's hospital of their kind to be rated outstanding in the UK. Now, if you listen to Sarah, the chief exec, on how she managed to do that, her and her team, one of the things she said in the report was by listening, learning, and continually improving. Listening to people about the mistakes they're making those lessons learned, and looking to improve time and time again. Paul Bear Bryant. For those who don't know him, he's a legendary NFL coach. This is a quote from him. When you make a mistake, there are only 3 things you should ever do about it. Admit it, learn from it, don't repeat it. So, how do we get our teams to admit it in the first place? Transactional analysis. Is anyone here a psychologist? Good, then I can say what it's one. This is a demonstration of my parenting skills. Anyone here got children? Anyone here got 4 children? Any more? Got 5. Oh, I feel your pain. They really know how to press your buttons. And this is an example of how I would parent. They come to me with mistakes, and my instinct is to get the finger out and start wagging it. Please don't do that. It's not right. Look at ego states then. So transaction analysis tells us that we've got 3 ego states. We've got parent, we've got adult, and we have child. Now, if one of your team comes to you and tells you they've made a mistake, they're coming to you as an adult. They're trying to give you information, trying to improve things. Maybe looking for some help and support as well. Now, as a manager, you've got a choice how you react. You can be nurturing parent, where you listen, you understand, you try and support them. Or you can be critical parent. Now, if you go for the critical parent, if the finger comes out and you start having a go at them, they're probably going to do one of two things. They'll move down to the child ego state, and you'll probably find they're either going to be rebellious child or compliant child. Now, rebellious isn't great, but at least you know what you're dealing with. They'll sit there, they'll shout, they'll get defensive, they'll get angry, they may storm out. Not a brilliant result, but at least you kind of know what you're dealing with. The flip side is they could be compliant child, where they put their hands up and they say, I'm really sorry, I will never, ever make that mistake again. And maybe that'll work. Maybe you'll have scared them so much they don't make that same mistake. But the chances are they probably will. And if they don't make that mistake, because we're all human, they will make another mistake. But what's the chance of them coming and telling you if they make another mistake? What are the chances of you knowing what happened and why it happened and making a plan to change that? It's not going to happen. If you ask Sarah Marsh, again, how she did that, how she transformed from inadequate to outstanding, one of the things she said, by treating staff with compassion. Not being that critical parent, being that nurturing parent, listening to her staff, understanding them, and looking after them. So, that's how we encourage people to make reports. How else do we do it? Education. Everybody, from top to bottom, needs to understand what culture you're trying to create and why you're trying to create it. Everyone needs to feel confident in it. Everyone here, I assume, comes from a trust where they've got either a no-blame culture or a just culture. If you haven't, raise your hand. Everyone's got one of those. I guarantee there'll be staff in every one of your trust who don't believe it, who don't trust it. It's not enough just to write down the policy. You need to educate people. You need to make them trust you. You need to handle it the right way as managers. When people come to you, you need to be that nurturing parent. Because if you don't, the trust won't be there, and this won't work. Everyone have reporting systems? Great. So they've got that. So once you've built their trust, they'll use the reporting systems to tell you what's happening. Then you've got to analyze the data. Then you've got to give them more training. If one person's made the mistake, the chances are everyone else will do. So roll that training out, get everyone the information they need. And then we have these things. If anyone not recognize this, this is the WHO checklist. Responsible for a 30% improvement in patient safety. 30% for a piece of paper. And it's just telling you the basics. It's telling you things that all surgeons, all anaesthetists know already, right? And yet they're still going to make mistakes. The great thing about checklists is that it takes all the lessons that you've learned as an organisation and condenses it down into one easy-to-use checklist. So when someone starts making decisions, when someone starts doing an operation or cleaning something, they're doing that with that wealth of knowledge behind them. If people are educated and they understand the importance of checklists, if checklists are well designed and they're a help, not a hindrance, they will have that whole wealth of experience behind them whenever they go out and make their decisions. We'll finish off by going back to Birmingham Children's Hospital. Sarah Marsh, who transformed it, said she did it by treating staff with compassion, being that nurturing parent, getting the culture right, listening, learning, continually improving, completing that learning cycle so you actually learn the lessons and you make things better, and building one giant healthcare team, everybody pulling in the same direction. You get it wrong, as I said before, that flow of information stops and you just make repeated error after repeated error. You get it right, you complete the learning cycle, you learn from your mistakes, it makes healthcare a safer, more efficient place. Ladies and gents, that is Black Box Culture.
Thank you very much.
Any questions?